Chapter 9. We can decide to let our trials crush us, or we can convert them to new forces of good. Helen Keller. Satan began to chant unrelenting curses that droned on mechanically. On cue, all the other demons did the same. The echoing choruses filled the air of the Pacific Ocean along the coast of Japan with crimson smoke that danced about the advancing ship. An armed ring of demons were stationed to block any attempt at interference. Satan glared at his opponent with burning hatred that made his red eyes bulge. His sulphurous breath spewed out through his widely gaping nostrils. He toyed with the words he shouted, watching to see if any of the angels would make the slightest move. They did not. With piercing accuracy, Satan sent a word laser blow in Michael's direction. The resounding clang of the blow connecting with his word shield rang out as Michael staggered backwards. Cheers and laughter came from the crowd. Returning his attention to the ship, he poised himself for the ensuing fight. He stood strong with his wings flared. Satan planned to increase the frequency and intensity of the upcoming earthquake. Joe Moretti's natural gas supertanker was his target. The sky was a searing cauldron of black ghouls, their tribe forming a swarming, living haze over the battle scene. The sounds of their chants formed a constant low-pitched hum that echoed back upon itself from the rocky shores below. The demons were very disturbed. Like angry bees, the demonic cloud continued to thicken and swirl. From his vantage point, Michael saw the glimmer of millions of pairs of red eyes. With cries and wails of rage, demons scattered everywhere. Murder's chin-length dark hair framed his face, which was a pale shade of onyx. It was hard to tell his features because they were twisted by his rage and thirst for death. His feral red eyes were dominant, difficult to look at. He glared viciously, shuddering and writhing every few seconds with vile words spewing from his lips. He bellowed forward, growing darker with each move. With a clang like thunder, earth began to move. The first jolt of stress coming out of the ocean floor sent a shockwave hurtling like a tornado. Several tons worth of water surged towards the tanker. At 4:30 p.m., a massive 9.1 magnitude earthquake struck just off the coast of Tokyo, Japan. The seismic waves it created on the Pacific Ocean floor set off tsunami waves that traveled at the speed of a jet plane. Waves 45 feet high pounded the ship. It was tossed like a tiny matchbook toy. On impact, an explosion of loud noise and shockwaves rang through the air. Windows shattered, black clouds of smoke and balls of flame shot into the sky. For stunned drivers on the road, the pulse of energy that tore through the ground resembled a 20-mile snake slithering across a pasture. Telephone poles whipped back and forth as if caught in a tempest. Power lines ripped loose in a shower of blue and yellow sparks. Lights went out, and the telephone system went down. The destructive force of Satan had been unleashed. The original shockwave blast of the explosion was the first of several phases of the destruction. The flying shrapnel of the exploding tanker carried such parts as walls, roof, floors, doors, windows, and ceiling. When the shockwave of the blast rose up between the skyscrapers of Tokyo, a vacuum effect created an implosion. Atmospheric pressure that was inside nearby buildings collapsed glass and parapet walls back onto the sidewalk and street. The explosion generated massive amounts of heat that caused secondary fires and structural collapse. Ground shockwaves broke gas, water, electric, and sewer pipes. Subway tunnels and building foundations were affected. There was nowhere to run. Japan was completely unprepared. All of a sudden, bam, it just hit. You could tell this was different from the other little tremors they had before. It just picked up in intensity. In downtown Tokyo, large buildings shook violently and people poured into the street for safety. Large buildings were on fire and bellowing smoke poured from the Odaiba district of Tokyo. In central Tokyo, trains were stopped and passengers walked along the tracks to platforms. 30 minutes after the quake, tall buildings were still swaying in Tokyo, and mobile phone networks were not working. The death toll was estimated to be in the neighborhood of 500,000, of which the entire crew of Joe's tanker was a part. This was one of the most devastating major natural catastrophes in modern history. Their answering screams were ear-piercing. Their bodies arched stiffly into distorted, unnatural positions. The dark shapes came closer, separating themselves into groups, solidifying their positions. Men, women, and children had been condemned to misery and death. Their cries intensified, becoming a mad, echoing drone of savage fury that rang over Tokyo like 1,000 firing weapons, spreading shrapnel filled with grumbling, whining, and yelping. Demonic forces shrieked, confusing ideas into the mind of anyone willing to listen. In the ensuing melee over the next few weeks, many more would die from their injuries. Finally, there was quiet. "You did an excellent job," Satan purred to Confusion, who had just returned from the battle. He stood on the other side of the cavern near the exit. Demons didn't like getting too close to each other. It was always wise to leave an avenue of escape in case the meeting turned sour. Demons that were wary of Satan tended to fare better than those who trusted him. Confusion gave off a creepy appearance. He never seemed to blink. Smug had seen him before, and at this meeting he made it obvious that he disliked this demon's presence. Confusion leveled his flat, unblinking gaze at Smug for so long that he began wondering if he made it a practice to eliminate his competition. Smug thought of him as one of Satan's assassins, but in fact he wasn't one of his regular crew. He was more of a free agent, doing whatever he pleased, and very difficult to control. When Confusion did not reply, didn't rush to assure Satan that he was honored to work for him the way the others had, Satan's fingers drummed impatiently on his thigh. It was a nervous habit he had when he wasn't comfortable, a telling little gesture. He wasn't exactly afraid, but he, too, was being wary, which meant there were two powerful demons in the room. Confusion suddenly looked at Satan, his dark gaze cool and assessing. He sucked in a breath and was actually considering the idea, weighing the cost of continuing to remain silent. Seeing no better alternative, he bowed silently in Satan's direction and snickered, "Thank you, my lord." Joe heard a mad pounding and a disturbing commotion at his front door. William Martin, his business partner, screamed, "Turn on the TV! Our ship has blown up! The largest earthquake in history just struck off the coast of Tokyo. The powerful tsunami that followed tossed the tanker like a football onto the shore. The explosion it caused has leveled parts of the city." Entering the family room, Joe clicked on the television and switched the channel to the news. "Don't worry so much. The insurance will cover this. I don't know how to tell you this, but I decided to self-insure the ship and cargo. I was hedging on the money we would make. I had no idea this would happen. This is horrible. I can't imagine the lawsuits that will be filed against your company. I don't even want to estimate how much we've lost. The ship, the cargo, the crew, and the damage the explosion caused. It seemed like everything you did turned to gold. I just thought I'd capitalize on this. You would make more money. You know, I always like to play on the edge." A piercing groan escaped from deep inside his chest as he collapsed onto Joe's couch. Both men's eyes were glued to the television screen. The reporter sat with a concerned look on her face. "The epicenter of the earthquake today was 80 miles off the coast of Tokyo, in the center of Japan, and it generated a tsunami wave up to 5 miles inland. The tremor was felt across Japan. The waves were mixed with mud, with ships and cars smashing and exploding into high-rise buildings in the business district, bashing them to pieces. The initial 10.2 magnitude earthquake was followed by aftershocks measuring 9.1 in magnitude. Tsunami warnings are in effect for much of the Pacific Rim. One natural gas supertanker went up in flames, adding additional destruction to the city. 11 nuclear plants were shut down." Just having awakened from a terrifying dream, Joe steeled his thoughts. His emotions raced, and he tried to avoid gazing at William's blue eyes. He thought back to the night he had stayed late at the office years ago. He felt that same uneasiness now. Why have I been so careless? I usually go over every contract with a fine-tooth comb. Why have I been so nervous and worried about everything while missing the most important issues? I'll need to call my lawyers. Why did I ever hire William? I should have given Christopher the job, or, at best, if he was interning for me, he might have caught this mistake. What is wrong with me? What has happened to my common sense? As soon as the first earthquake ended, a swarm of demons left for Joe's ranch. Right behind them, so dangerously close, was a brilliant fiery meteor carrying the force of the sun itself. The black creatures and the meteor shot into the sky, zigzagging, shooting this way and that like wild fireworks. Satan and his hordes descended on the ranch, a blizzard of screeching fiends. The storm exploded out of the sky, raining a glittering inferno in all directions. You could feel the heat of the warriors' words. The buildings, cattle, and land were consumed by them. On the right, a long, slithering spirit yelled one more curse over the prairie before curling tightly and rising to watch the destruction. Sodom and Gomorrah once again. On his left, a loud-mouthed, boasting imp cursed, filling the air with blasphemies. He was quick and confident, knowing that he would prevail. His face wore a proud sneer, and then it was over. The demons were gone, but not before Joe's ranch was decimated. "Are you sure you have destroyed it?" asked Satan. Forebodin made sure. "Everything is dead, if that's what you mean." Mayhem added, "Only one employee remains alive, and he is injured and frightened." Satan replied, "Then the end is near, and there is no stopping it." While he was still thinking, his cell phone rang. Joe listened as his face filled with horror. "Joe, I've some horrible news. A large flash of light, a huge detonating fireball, streaked across the sky. I've never seen anything like it. This massive meteor shower appeared as a shooting star lighting the entire sky. As it grew closer to the ground, it shed glowing material in its wake. Fire fell from the sky and burned up your cattle ranch in Texas. There are dead people and cattle everywhere. I'm your only surviving employee." Joe tried to calm himself and said he would try to be there tomorrow to sort through things. At least his children were safe. Why is all this happening? A meteor from nowhere! Why hadn't I heard of its approach on the news? I would have thought it would be there. It's like it just happened miraculously. Wrong word. It's not a miracle. More like an anti-miracle, if there is such a thing. What am I going to do? Michael heard a distinctive whistle. It was Raphael signaling trouble. He shot down the length of the attic, out the end of the house and into the concealing branches of a large pepper tree. And then there was trouble. The demons appeared first, whirling and soaring in a flock of at least 1,000. They weren't too large, probably not frontliners, but deadly nevertheless. Michael had to wince, just gazing at those flashing fangs and hearing their piercing, razor-sharp words. He needed to avoid assailing that bunch for the time being. More important business was at hand. Then a second band appeared, all cackling and chattering, some sitting on the neighbors' roofs, some just flitting about the front deck looking for mischief. "Lord help us!" Joel exclaimed. Raphael hadn't seen these two yet. From inside the police car, like huge, hulking monsters, two demons emerged and watched with their red eyes darting about with great guardedness. They were searching the area for intruders. They were vicious characters indeed. There was something about them that Raphael could sense, something more sinister and wicked than most. Oh no. Beyond the shore, just out where the waves began to break, another large detachment of demons approached like a swarm of hornets, appearing as a long, thin charcoal smudge across the horizon. While he was still speaking, he could hear footsteps, urgent, thumping footsteps, several sets of feet. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw police officers approaching his front door. The sharp rap on the seldom-used door made him jump. He saw the outlines of 2 men and a woman dressed in uniforms. Flinging the door open, he heard the lead officer say, "We're looking for Joseph Moretti. We were told that he lives here." "Yes, I'm Joseph Moretti." The officer's face wore a placid smile, and he could smell the faint scent of her perfume. Her hair was tied back in a bun. Her brownish-amber eyes reminded Joe of a cage panther in search of solace. They were watchful and somewhat sad. She took out a notebook. "There's been a home invasion at your son Christopher's home. We're sorry to inform you that we believe your children are dead. Once you have had some time to process this, you will need to provide DNA samples or come in to make a positive ID." Joe felt light-headed with grief. A moment of silence passed. The preliminaries were brief, the time of the incident and the names of the deceased. "I understand how distressed you must be, so we will leave you to contact other family members. If you have any further questions, you can call us. Here is my card." With that, the officer handed Joe her card, closed her notebook, and then she turned and walked away. Then Joe took a deep breath and turned slowly to find Grace. She was standing near the family room doorway with her back against the wall, and she boldly met Joe's look. "Grace," he said, his voice nearly inaudible, "our children are dead." She saw Joe's agony, the torture in his face. "What?" she screamed. She abhorred his expression. "What happened?" she asked, though of course she already knew the answer. It took Joe a moment to answer her. "Our children, all of them, are dead," he whispered. His eyes were as guarded as if she were another enemy. More than guarded, they were afraid. Joe stood frozen. Tears poured down his cheeks, and they cast a dark shadow over him. Grace's mind was panicky, stunned, and as useless as her body. She stared at Joe in bewilderment. Sorrow exploded in her skull, mental fireworks that obliterated both thought and action. She didn't react. She couldn't. She stood there, violently trembling, because she was incapable of doing more. Then she sat on the couch as everything went black. "Oh, Grace," Joe sighed in grief. Grace was first aware of cool hands touching her forehead. "Joe," she whispered. "Yes, I'm here." She got her eyes to open and stare off in unbelief. Joe watched her eyes carefully for some sign that she would be okay. Grace struggled, trying to sit up. Her body shook in a frenzied fear. Joe realized what she was doing and helped her. She stared at the television. Then she was aware of the voices around her. They were buzzing at first, and then they grew in volume, but she did not want to listen. Her mind needed protection. It was trapped in the knowledge of what had just happened. Her pain was now part of the blackness that filled the room. She felt totally disconnected from her body. She couldn't think. Her mind felt simultaneously imprisoned and out of control. But she could do nothing about it. The agony was too strong for her soul to process. There was no escape from it. "Joe," she sobbed. "No, no, no, no." He drew several deep, ragged breaths. His actions were instinctive, given without thought. He tried denying his feelings, but they came automatically. So much pain, peppered with rage and fear. His thoughts raced. What will people say? When you lose a spouse, you're a widow. A child who loses his parents is an orphan, but there is no name for me. That's how awful this is. Oh, my God. Then he fell to his knees, sobbing. God has given, and God has taken away." Joe had never been in fear for his life, but he could imagine how afraid his children had been that night, how they feared their imminent death. Imagining was what he did. He imagined the panic of lying in pain, the abuse, the fear, the confusion. Despair settled in as a permanent guest. Add up all these tragedies, and it was too much for one person to handle. Yet in all this, Joe refused to accuse God with wrongdoing. What infuriated Joe was there was no one to blame, but perhaps himself. All his illusion had been shattered. An unseen force had destroyed them. He accepted each blow, as he felt he must, but he could not help asking himself the question, why? Why have Grace and I been singled out for this bad luck? Why has God withdrawn himself from us? What have we done? How will we ever be happy again? Why me? Why my business? Why Christopher, William, Luke, Sarah, and Jennifer? We aren't bad people. We don't deserve this. We went to church. Why didn't God warn us? Stop this. Why? Joe couldn't remember a time in his life when he had been dishonest or ruthless. Not once in his adult life had he ever made a decision based on doing what was criminal. Sure, he wanted to make a lot of money, but his reputation was more important. He had gone out of his way to help his friends, sacrificed his own material needs for his children and his aged parents, and even gave to local charities. Joe had looked out for everyone, first, last, and always. He hoped in the depths of his heart that his godliness had been authentic and that someday he would be vindicated. Joe's profound anguish robbed him of his ability to understand how God worked, and therefore God had become a great enigma to him. Overflowing with anguish, puzzlement, anger, and bitter complaints, he still clung to hope. Yet part of him wanted to turn his back on God, to march off, godless, into the dark night. Joe had considered himself a strong person, someone willing to take risks and accept consequences. But after all the news, he could feel himself sinking fast. Taking on whatever had caused this evil required more physical and moral courage than Joe feared he had. His whole being desperately yearned, not so much for the gifts God had given him, but for a sign that he was still there.